Okay, on to our last speaker for this session. I'd like to invite up Dr. Terry McCosker. We've heard from Terry a few times during this conference, and hopefully you had a chance to catch up with him during the proceedings. He's a wealth of knowledge and he's really approachable and happy to chat. So Terry is one of the great innovators of Australian agriculture, who's had an inordinate impact on agricultural practices over the years. And on this basis, the Central Queensland University conferred on Terry a degree of Honorary Doctor in Agribusiness in March in 2015. He's been awarded an OAM in the 2021 Queen's Birthday Honours List for his contribution to agriculture. He's also a Churchill Fellow, something everyone should seriously look at as part of their career. So I encourage you to do that. One of Terry's greatest lifetime achievements has been to effectively bridge the gap between the contesting paradigms of traditional agriculture and regenerative agriculture, helping to ensure the long-term survival of Australian agriculture and its farming families. Terry co-founded Resource Consulting Services in 1985, which has set a benchmark for capacity building in rural and regional Australia and has been independently rated by the Australian Government surveys. I'd like to invite you up, Terry, to present to the crowd.
Thank you. My journey into regenerative agriculture, and it wasn't called that then, started in the mid-80s, and I was running a property in the Northern Territory. We had about 12,000 breeders and 826,000 acres to play with. And I'd increased the stocking rate on some of that country from a beast to 100 acres to a beast to 35 acres, and thinking that was pretty safe. And within 5 years, I saw a decline in the desirable perennial grasses in that landscape. And I got consultants in all sorts of areas, in ecology, rangeland management. I had all sorts of people to try and explain to me why my desirable perennials were disappearing out of my pasture. And this was native pasture that was basically pristine when I started. And nobody could tell me why. And I had a bad gut feel about that. I knew there was something wrong. There had to be a reason for it. And I didn't discover the reason for that until about 5 years later in 1989. And that's when my journey started into grazing management. And that journey started actually when I met Dr. Stan Parsons in '89, and then we started with the Grazing for Profit School in 1990. And when we started in '89, '90, we didn't actually have a set of principles around grazing management. And I was very fortunate at that stage to get a Churchill Fellowship to go around the world and study grazing management, which I did in 1991. And I went everywhere where Parsons and Savoury had ever been. And I found lots of failures. I was looking for failures. And I found lots of successes. When I found the failures, I was looking for what are the reasons for those failures. And I could fault the management, but I couldn't fault the principles. And so that led me to really become much more principle focused. And yesterday I talked about principles being a way to manage on the other side of complexity. So profound simplicity, using principles is a way to manage profound simplicity. So over the last 30 odd years, these principles have evolved. But firstly, I just wanted to get some terminology right, because there's an enormous array of grazing systems available. So there's continuous grazing, there's what's called rotational grazing, rotational resting rather, there's rotational grazing, there's multi-camp rotational grazing, and there's time-controlled grazing methods. And within each of those, there's another bewildering array of names. So for me to be able to understand grazing management, when I was trying to study it in 1991, I had to work out, well, what's the difference between these things and what do all these names mean in the literature and that people were using? And so continuous grazing is defined as where plants are continuously exposed to animals. And when you're trying to work out a terminology for grazing systems, you've got to have a basis to to base that on, and I based it on the plant. Many grazing systems and terminologies are actually based on the animal. So this is based on the plant. And a very old and distinguished client of mine, who's been a client now for about 30 years, said to me that, he said, Terry, when I first got exposed to this, I thought that I was a livestock producer. Then I realised I'm actually a grass producer. And then about 15 years later, he said, no, I really realise I'm a soil manager. And my grass is an output of managing soils, and my livestock is an output of managing grass. And so I look at this from the grass's perspective. And then back in about the 1920s, 1930s, rotational resting started to appear. In fact, continuous grazing wasn't invented until the mid-1850s when wire was invented. And so before that, we had shepherds. We actually had rotations and time-controlled grazing. Rotational resting is basically where there's a paddock somewhere on the place, or a couple of paddocks that don't have animals in them. And then we can actually go right back into the 16th century and find examples of rotational grazing. But it sort of came into prominence a little bit in the research sector in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. But it's calendar-based, and that's its flaw. So rotational grazing is a number of paddocks, basically, but the moves are calendar-based. You're moving the animal once a week, once a fortnight, once every 3 months, whatever it is, but it's based on the calendar. And then the ante got upped on that, so we got a lot more paddocks. That's called multi-camp rotational grazing. Basically, we've got a lot of paddocks, but it's still calendar-based. And then in the 1940s and 50s, Voisin developed the time-controlled grazing systems, which was picked up by Parsons and Savory in the 60s, who brought it into the rest. It used to be something that was used in the dairy industry only, and they brought it into the rest of us. So the difference between time-controlled grazing and rotational grazing is time-controlled grazing is based on the growth rate of the plant, whereas rotational grazing based on a piece of paper hanging on the wall. So we've got a problem, Houston, in that we have livestock that have certain requirements, and we have plants that almost have opposing requirements. So we've got animals put pressure down onto the pasture they eat for today. And animals will go into a paddock and they'll eat the best feed in the paddock that's there today. They're not worried about tomorrow, the day after, or 4 months' time. But your plants need to be managed up, which is what Judy just so beautifully described. So we've got to manage that grass because the livestock will not manage it. And so now it becomes, how do we go about managing it? And so these principles have evolved over a long period of time, and I'll go through them one at a time. The first principle is about people. That is, plan, monitor, and manage what we're doing. And Judy's, again, just so beautifully described. Planning your grazing, planning and monitoring your feed, planning your feed budget. It never ceases to amaze me that the most important asset a grazier has is the grass on their property, and most of them have got absolutely no idea how much there is. It's not budgeted properly. I can only just really reinforce where Judy's just been. And so we've got to plan it, monitor it. In other words, this is about you as a manager, and unless you're involved in management and making the decisions, the livestock will make them for you, and they're making them for today. So it's about thinking ahead. And that is the sort of planning that Judy's just gone through. And there's a whole lot, we'll go into this a little bit more, but it's the physical layout. It's what I call nutritional seasons. So how are we planning our feed budgeting and the quality of feed for each season and for the requirements of animals? How are we matching animal requirements to feed availability? And monitoring. I think one of the most important aspects in being a farmer And there's an old saying that says that the most important fertiliser a farm should receive is the footprints of a farmer and its observations. Well, I don't think we can manage these things from computers. So what do we need to plan? There's a massive array of the things that we need to plan. And I liken it to saying that if we are moving from a continuous grazing or a rotational grazing or a very small sort of low-level grazing system to a higher level time-controlled grazing system, it's a bit like going from a juggler who can juggle 3 balls very easily, and then suddenly you've got 13 balls in the air. And it requires skill. There's a lot of science involved here, but there's just as much skill as there is science. And we've got to learn that skill. So there's a lot of things to plan and a lot of things to monitor. And one of the things that I like to see, and it's really useful over time, is to look at what changes you've actually made in the landscape. And it's great to look back because your memory is not good enough to remember this sort of thing. And so in that particular example, there was a 3-fold increase in the carrying capacity of that country there from 2006 to 2013, and there was no other change other than managing the rest period and the stocking rate and matching the stocking rate to the carrying capacity of that country. So as Judy said, we can reverse damage, we can increase carrying capacities. And the greatest tool, and I think one of the greatest secrets in terms of the grazing industry around the world, is the grazing chart. This is the best tool that I have ever seen. It was developed by Alan Savory a long time ago, 40 to 50 years ago. And it's both a planning tool and a monitoring tool. And the grazing chart is the only tool that I know of that can predict a drought. It's also the only tool that I know of that can tell you when a drought is over. And those are 2 very hard things to judge otherwise. So we've got to manage. We've got to manage our ecosystem. And I look at it as a pie. We've got carbon, we've got ecosystem services, we've got the water cycle, soil health, biodiversity, and energy flow, etc. We've got to manage that pie, but we have to be involved in managing that. It's our intellect that goes into that. The second principle is about rest. It's adjusting the rest period to suit the growth rate of the plant. Very simple principle, and it really is, it's based on this sigmoid curve. Now, normally I spend half an hour to 3/4 of an hour explaining how the sigmoid curve works, how it influences soil health, how it influences ruminant nutrition, how energy flows in different directions throughout the growth and production of a plant. But this is it's a simple sort of a guideline to how we need to manage. And we need to be managing generally off what I call the top of the power curve. And again, that's what Judy was saying. You don't want to get down here. You want to be up here at the top of that power curve so you can manage and maximise productivity. But of course, we've got to manage over seasons. And we all have a season where we have to accumulate feed. We might, if we're lucky, have a season where we can ration it or where we can manage it across the top. And then we have a season where we have no production and we've got to manage what we've got and ration it out. In fact, Voisin's original grazing system was called rational grazing because it was about rationing. So how do we know what phase of the plant we're in? This is what tells you what phase your animals are eating. Become interested in dung, right, and observe the shape of that dung, whether you've got cattle or sheep. You still need to watch that dung and it will tell you what your animals are eating and whether you've got it right or wrong. The third principle is matching stocking rate to carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is something which grows up from the ground. It's influenced by temperature, rainfall management, and residual dry matter, as Judy described. So that's what you grow. Stocking rate is what you put on it. That's how many DSEs that you're actually running. And these two things are vertically opposed. And this is the hardest principle to get right, because carrying capacity can change overnight. You can get a frost, you can get a fire, you can get a flood, or you can get rain. And so carrying capacity changes. So if we've got over here on your left, if we've got a lot of feed, more feed than we've got livestock, then we're understocked. On the right-hand side, if we've got more livestock than we've got feed, then we're overstocked. The goal of this principle is to be in the middle, to try and match stocking rate to carrying capacity. It's an aspirational goal. It's not something that you can achieve all the time, but certainly we need to aspire to it. Now, you make a mistake there and there might be some serious consequences. I was driving around with Bud Williams 20 odd years ago now, and I was running through the grazing principles. And I said to Bud, what do you think of our grazing principles? And Bud said, he said, yeah, I think they're really good. He said, except for one thing. I said, what's that? He said, there's nothing in the principles about livestock. And he was absolutely right. We'd gone 10 years with a set of grazing principles and had nothing in there for the livestock. This now turns out to be the biggest principle and one of the most complex principles to actually manage. So there's a lot of influences on animal production. So this principle is really about animal performance, gross margins, and your business performance. So there's nutrition. Water quantity and quality is one of the biggest ones and where some of the biggest mistakes are made. Distance walk to feed, probably on some of the scales you're on, that's probably not such an issue. Animal health, diseases, parasites, and those things generally lower or get less when you get your grazing management right. Timing of reproduction is another big one. I was talking to somebody last night saying that most people around here are still calving in autumn. Well, if you're going to match feed supply to animal demand, then that makes no sense to me. And then if we change grazing management, we open up a whole lot of doors that we need to be careful with. We've got to match stocking rate to carrying capacity. If stocking rate exceeds carrying capacity, animal production will be lower. Guaranteed. The length of the graze period will also determine animal performance. The longer our graze periods, the lower our animal performance is likely to be within a rotation. If we get the rest period wrong, what's likely, if our rest period is too long, for example, then we're going to end up with lignified feed and poor animal performance. If the utilisation rate's too high, Judy's already explained that, utilisation, if we go too far with utilisation, it not only affects pasture production, it also affects animal production. If residual dry matter's too low, Judy's already explained that one as well. And livestock stress. One of the things that I did not understand, when I went around the world studying grazing management in 1991, the way everyone was doing it was going up to a gate, blowing a whistle or whatever, all the animals come running, you open the gate, you see everything, and away they're gone. In 5 minutes, the whole thing's over. And we thought that was absolutely brilliant. But we also had problems with animal production that we couldn't explain. And it wasn't until Bud Williams came out here, I think he was 99, and Bud explained to us the problem was stress. We were moving these animals the wrong way. They were spending their life anticipating the next move. If you see animals that run up to you when if you'll go anywhere near them, you've got a problem. Those animals are not eating. They're anticipating a move. So improving stress or de-stressing or using low-stress stock handling techniques is absolutely critical in any system where you're going to be moving animals on a very regular basis. Otherwise, they get very, very bad habits and you'll end up with suboptimal animal production. And animal welfare. And one of the biggest issues we find here is actually water quality. So monitor water quality. We use magnets in a lot of areas to clean up water quality. And we know that it affects, this is in cattle, has a significant impact on growth rate and conception rates if you have poor quality water. And if they're not drinking enough, I've found in many instances animals drinking 1/3 of their requirements because of the quality of the water, and that's going to impact on animal performance. So I'd mentioned stressed livestock. Stressed livestock often lead to stressed people. I reckon the chopper pilot must have been having a ball watching that. But, you know, and here's a group of sheep that are not stressed. I think there's about 10,000 in this mob, and it's all very calm. Stock density is a sexy principle. It's where the horsepower is in a grazing system, but it's principle number 5. Don't go there until you've got the rest right. It provides for us, wrong way here. It provides even utilisation, top-down utilisation and animal impact to the things we get out of that are really important. And density works in thresholds. So there are low thresholds, medium thresholds and high thresholds, and then really, really high thresholds when it comes to density. The final principle is about biodiversity, and that biodiversity has come up in almost every conversation this week, and it is just as critical in grazing management as it is in virtually every other conversation that we've had this week. You know, whether it's biodiversity in terms of plants or trees, whether it's biodiversity in terms of the animals that we run, the plant community itself, etc. So if we take these grazing principles and see what they're for, so we'll run through these. And then, so principle number 1, we said earlier, is for the people. The second 2 principles are for the ecosystem. If you get those 2 principles wrong, your ecosystem is actually going to be going backwards. If you get them right, your ecosystem will go forward. Principle number 4, managing livestock effectively, is about gross margins, and it's about your income, and it's about your profitability, and it's about your animal welfare, and everything to do with your animals and your production. Never forget that it's the sheep and the cows that pay the bills. And the last 2 are for ecosystem and business. They're more icing on the cake, and they will affect both outcomes. So there's a lot of, you know, there's a purpose. These principles have taken a long time, and they've been stable for probably 10 years now, but they're in the right order. And if you've got any problem in any system, you look at a landscape and you wonder what's wrong, if you work through those principles in order, you'll work out what's wrong and what you need to do to fix it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll pull up there.